The moment Mabel Boone stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1882, every man on Main Street stopped what he was doing and stared, and Clark Wilcox, leaning against the post of the general store with his hat tipped low and a toothpick balanced between his teeth, felt something shift inside his chest like a stone rolling off a ledge and dropping into deep, clear water. She was not what anyone had expected. The town of Dusty Creek had been waiting on a schoolteacher, ordered up through a letter-writing arrangement with the Harlan County Education Board out of Austin. Most folks had imagined someone gray-haired and stern with a ruler perpetually in hand. What arrived instead was a young woman of 24 with dark auburn hair pinned loosely beneath a wide-brimmed traveling hat, a practical brown dress dusted with the road, and eyes the color of a summer sky just before a storm rolls in, not quite blue, not quite gray, but something that managed to be both at once. Clark watched her from beneath the shadow of his hat brim as she descended the coach steps with a worn leather traveling bag in one hand and a crate of books tucked under the other arm. She stood there on the dirt street of Dusty Creek, looked up at the sun-bleached buildings with their peeling paint and sun-warped signs, and instead of the disappointment most newcomers could not hide, she smiled. It was a small, private sort of smile, the kind a person gives when they have made up their mind about something and find it suits them fine. Clark straightened off the post without entirely meaning to. Hank Prout, the town's postmaster and self-appointed welcomer of strangers, bustled out from the crowd and thrust his hand toward Mabel with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting years for something interesting to happen in Dusty Creek. "Miss Boone, I presume," Hank said, pumping her hand. "We are so glad you have arrived. We have been without a schoolteacher for going on 11 months now, and the children are running completely wild." "That is precisely why I am here," Mabel said, and her voice was clear and warm and carried the quiet confidence of someone who had learned a long time ago that the world moved more easily when you walked into it with your head level. "Where will I be staying?" "We have arranged a room above the milliner's shop for you," Hank said. "Mrs. Caldwell runs it, very respectable woman. The schoolhouse is just down at the end of Birch Street. It needs some work, I will be honest with you, but the bones of it are sound." "I have worked with worse bones," Mabel said simply, and hefted her crate of books as though the matter were settled. It was then that she turned her gaze down the street, taking in the full breadth of Dusty Creek for the first time, and her eyes landed on Clark Wilcox. He had not moved. He was still standing there by the general store post, toothpick and all, watching her with the particular focus of a man who has just seen something he cannot quite categorize and finds the puzzle of it entirely absorbing. Mabel looked at him for a single, frank moment. Clark touched the brim of his hat. She looked away and followed Hank Prout down the street. Clark stood there a moment longer, then exhaled slowly through his nose and pushed off the post. He had been planning to ride out to the Garner Ranch before sundown to check on a horse he'd been contracted to break. He had ridden more than half the state of Texas in his 28 years and never once found a reason to stay in any town longer than a job demanded. He walked to his horse instead, untied her from the rail, swung up into the saddle, and told himself firmly to stop thinking about the color of a schoolteacher's eyes. He mostly failed at that for the entire ride to the Garner Ranch. The horse he had been hired to break was a big roan gelding with a nasty streak and a tendency to spin left without warning. Clark worked him for 2 hours in the corral while old Gerald Garner watched from the fence with a critical eye and a plug of tobacco in his cheek. "Heard the schoolteacher arrived," Gerald said between spits. "She did," Clark said, bringing the roan to a reluctant halt. "They say she's young." "Young enough." Gerald squinted at him. "You noticed that, did you?" "I have eyes," Clark said flatly, and turned the roan into a figure-8 to change the subject. Gerald laughed, a dry sound like leaves skittering across hardpan. "You have eyes and a reputation for not using them on anything that ain't a horse or a trail out of town. Might be this teacher changes things." "Nothing changes things," Clark said, and he said it with the practiced ease of a man who has said it enough times that he nearly believes it. He finished with the roan as the sun went amber and low over the western hills. Gerald paid him in coin and a side of smoked pork, and Clark rode back toward Dusty Creek with no particular reason to go there except that his gear was at the livery, and he had a standing arrangement for a cot at the back of it. He was not looking for Mabel Boone on the way back through town. He simply noticed her because she was hard not to notice. She was standing outside the schoolhouse at the far end of Birch Street with the door propped open, hauling out a broken desk chair with the kind of determined physical effort that suggested she had not waited for anyone to offer help. There was a pile of dust and old tack and broken furniture accumulating in the street beside her. She had removed her jacket and rolled her sleeves to the elbow, and her hair had mostly escaped its pins and was curling softly around her face in the evening heat. Clark pulled his horse to a slow stop. Mabel looked up, pushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, and regarded him with those storm-sky eyes. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, not unkindly but with the tone of someone who has limited daylight left and would prefer not to waste it. "Probably not," Clark said. He sat his horse comfortably, the way men do when they have spent so much time in the saddle that it is more natural than standing. "You need a hand with that." Mabel glanced at the broken chair and her grip, then back at him. "I seem to be managing." "You do," he agreed. "I am just saying you would manage faster with two sets of hands." She looked at him for a moment, as though taking an inventory of him, the road-worn boots, the practical hands, the calm in his face that was not quite indifference but was something close to it until you looked at his eyes, which were honest and brown, and watching her with a directness that she found, to her mild surprise, did not irritate her the way such attention usually did. "All right," she said. "There is a broken beam across the back threshold that I cannot move by myself. If you are willing to help with that, I will not stop you." Clark swung down from his horse and tied her to the school fence. He followed Mabel into the schoolhouse, which smelled of old wood and dust and the particular neglect of a building that had sat closed for almost a year. The afternoon sun came through the south-facing windows in long golden bars, illuminating floating dust motes and the rows of scarred wooden desks. "It has good bones," Clark observed, looking around. Mabel glanced at him with something that might have been surprise. "That is exactly what I thought. Schoolhouses usually do. They build them to last. It is the people who run them that tend to move on." "I am not planning to move on," she said, and there was a certainty in it that was not a boast, simply a statement of fact. Clark said nothing to that. He found the broken beam at the back threshold, a heavy length of pine that had come down from an interior wall strut and was blocking the back door entirely. He got his shoulder under it, shifted his grip, and with considerable effort moved it clear in two heaves. The back door swung open and let in a rush of warm evening air. "Thank you," Mabel said, and she meant it without ceremony, the way people do when they are used to doing things themselves and accept genuine help with simple gratitude. "Clark Wilcox," he said, turning and putting out his hand. "Mabel Boone," she said, and shook it. Her hand was small, but her grip was firm. He registered both things and filed them away with the rest of what he was learning about her, which was already considerably more than he'd learned about most people in whole seasons of knowing them. "Are you from Dusty Creek, Mr. Wilcox?" she asked, going back to sorting through the rubbish that had accumulated in the back corner. "No," he said. "I go where the work is, horse breaking mostly, some trail riding. I have been through here a few times over the years." "So you do not have roots here?" "I do not have roots much of anywhere," he said, and he said it easily, without the defensiveness of a man who has been asked about it too many times and resents the question. Mabel handed him a pile of broken desk boards to carry out. "Is that by design or circumstance?" He considered the question more seriously than most people would have. "Both, I suppose. Started out circumstance, kept on by design." She nodded as though that made sense to her, and somehow, the fact that she didn't push or prod at it didn't try to peel back the curtain the way people sometimes did when they sensed a story behind a short answer, made him trust her just slightly more than a stranger deserved. They worked together in the schoolhouse for another hour as the sun went down. Clark hauled out the debris while Mabel took inventory of what was salvageable, which desks could be repaired, which window latch needed replacing, whether the wood stove in the corner still drew properly. She moved through the space with focused efficiency and quiet purpose, and she asked good questions and listened carefully to the answers. When she found the small bookshelf in the corner still intact, she pressed her hand flat against the wood with a look of quiet relief that caught Clark completely off guard in its tenderness. "I brought 32 books with me," she said, more to herself than to him. "I was worried I would not have a shelf to put them on." 32 books, he repeated. "That is more books than most households in this county." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Books are the only thing worth carrying a long distance." He thought about that while he hauled the last broken chair out to the street pile. When the schoolhouse was reasonably cleared and the light was nearly gone, they stood together in the doorway. The sky over Dusty Creek had gone to deep orange at the edges and a luminous violet overhead, and the town was settling into its evening sounds, the distant piano from the saloon on 3rd Street, the smell of supper smoke rising from chimneys. "I appreciate your help, Mr. Wilcox," Mabel said. "Clark," he said. "Mr. Wilcox is what they call my father, and I have not seen him in 12 years, so the title does not sit right on me." She smiled then fully, and it was such a warm and real thing that he felt it somewhere below his sternum in a way that was entirely inconvenient and impossible to ignore. "Clark, then," she said. "Thank you." He walked back to his horse and swung up. Mabel stood in the schoolhouse doorway watching, one arm resting on the doorframe, the evening breeze moving a loose strand of hair across her cheek. "The school opens Monday," she said. He looked at her from the saddle. "I know. You could come see what it looks like when it is properly set up," she said, and then she seemed slightly surprised at herself for saying it, which Clark found altogether charming. "I might do that," he said, and tipped his hat, and rode back toward the livery with the very firm and deeply unconvincing resolution that he would be on the road before Monday came. He was not on the road before Monday came. He told himself it was because Gerald Garner had another horse that needed work, and that was true. He also told himself that the bunkhouse at the livery was comfortable enough, and the food at Me's dining hall on 2nd Street was better than trail cooking, and that was true as well. He did not tell himself anything about storm-colored eyes or the way a schoolteacher had looked with her sleeves rolled up and her hair loose in the evening light, because that sort of truth had a way of changing things, and he was not entirely sure he was prepared for things to change. On Saturday, 2 days before the school opened, the men who did carpentry work in Dusty Creek gathered at the schoolhouse to make the repairs Mabel had requested. Clark showed up among them without exactly deciding to, the way a compass needle points north without being asked. He worked alongside Pete Dorsey the carpenter and a quiet Tejano man named Louis Reyes, who was the finest woodworker in the county and didn't advertise it. Together, they replaced the broken window latch, repaired 4 desks, reinforced the shelving, and patched the gap in the back wall where weather had gotten in. Mabel moved around them all morning, steady and organized, directing without bossing, making coffee over the wood stove for the workers, and every so often reading aloud a line from whatever book she happened to be shelving as though the passage had struck her, and she saw no reason to keep it to herself. The men found this somewhat startling at first and then entirely pleasant. At noon, she had brought enough cornbread and salt pork from Me's to feed everyone, and they sat on the new schoolhouse steps in the midday sun eating together, and the conversation ranged easily over horses and weather and the state of the roads west of the creek, and the best approach for teaching arithmetic to children who had spent too long working rather than learning. Clark sat on the bottom step below Mabel and said very little, which was his custom. but he listened to everything, which was also his custom. And once she said something so precisely right about the way children learn through story, rather than rote repetition, that he turned and looked at her with frank admiration. And she caught the look, and held it for a moment before she looked back at Pete Dorsey, who was asking her something about the school calendar. The schoolhouse opened on Monday morning to 17 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, and the whole of Dusty Creek seemed to exhale with relief. Parents brought their children to the door with a mixture of gratitude and slight trepidation, sizing up this young woman who had come to educate their offspring, and Mabel received them all with the same grounded, unhurried warmth that made them feel, almost immediately, that she was exactly who the town had needed. Clark watched the opening from across the street, leaning on the post of Harlan's dry goods store with his hat tipped low and his toothpick in his teeth, exactly the way he had been standing when she arrived. He was aware of the symmetry of this and chose not to examine it too closely. He rode out to the Garner Ranch that afternoon and spent 3 days there, finishing with the second horse, a steel-gray mare with more spirit than sense, and considerably more sense than she first appeared. When he came back into town on Thursday evening, the first person he saw was Mabel Boone coming out of the mercantile with a paper sack of chalk and a spool of twine, and she looked up and saw him and smiled in the plain, open way of someone who is genuinely glad to see a person and sees no particular reason to disguise it. "How was the mare?" she asked. He stopped his horse. "How did you know about the mare?" "Gerald Garner's wife came to enroll her grandchildren on Monday," Mabel said. "She told me you were the best horse breaker in the county, and also that you had been riding out of every town you'd ever worked in since you were about 16 years old, and she wanted me to know because she thought you seemed like a decent sort who could use something to come back to." She said this entirely without embarrassment or manipulation, just as a statement of facts relayed to her by a well-meaning woman. Clark sat on his horse and looked at Mabel Boone for a long moment. "Mrs. Garner talks a great deal," he said finally. "She does," Mabel agreed pleasantly. "She is also perceptive." He did not argue the point. He found himself back in Dusty Creek the following Monday and the Monday after that. The Garner horses were long finished, but there were other horses. A rancher named Beaumont to the south had a string of young mustangs that needed work, and the roundabout route from Beaumont spread to the next job west of Amarillo just happened to run through Dusty Creek if you were willing to add 2 days to the ride, which Clark found himself increasingly willing to do. He and Mabel fell into an informal friendship the way two people do when they are both honest about who they are and find, to their mutual and quiet surprise, that who the other person is happens to suit them rather well. They met most evenings on the schoolhouse steps, where Mabel would grade papers or plan lessons in the last of the daylight, and Clark would sit on the bottom step eating an apple or whittling something unnecessary out of a stick, and they would talk. They talked about everything and nothing: the book she was teaching, the routes he'd ridden, the particular character of the Texas sky in different seasons and from different elevations. She had grown up in Galveston, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a botanist mother who had cataloged every plant on the Texas Gulf Coast and written a modest pamphlet about them that Mabel kept in her crate of 32 books. He had grown up on a failing cattle operation outside of Waco, the youngest of 4 boys, the only one who'd left and kept leaving. "Did you miss it?" she asked him one evening. "Home, I mean, when you first left." "For a while," he said. "Then I got far enough away that the missing became something you carry rather than something that pulls you back." She was quiet for a moment, tracing the edge of a student's copybook with her thumbnail. "I understand that feeling," she said. "I left Galveston at 19. My mother had died 2 years before and my father was ill. When he passed, I had nothing keeping me there. I trained in Austin for teaching and then took posts wherever they needed someone." She looked up at the violet evening sky. "I have been in 4 towns in 5 years, but this one felt different when I stepped off that coach." "Different how?" Clark asked. She considered. "Like it could be a place rather than a stop." Clark looked at the row of ordinary buildings on Birch Street, the crooked fence posts, and the old oak that had split the sidewalk with its root years ago, and nobody had ever gotten around to fixing. He had passed through this town enough times to know it, but he had never quite looked at it the way she was looking at it now, like it was worth looking at. "You have a talent," he said slowly, "for seeing things the way they could be rather than the way they are." "Is that a compliment?" she asked. "It is the best kind of thing a person can be," he said, and he meant it so completely that she went quiet and looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something careful and wondering, like she was deciding whether to trust what she had just heard. The autumn came in fast and gold over the Texas plains. The creek bed dried to a thread and then went dry entirely in September, which was a worry for the ranches that depended on it, and Clark spent 2 weeks that month helping Lloyd Beaumont's crew sink a secondary well on the south pasture, because it was the right thing to do and he was there, and had the expertise, and Lloyd was fair-minded, and paid him honestly for the extra work. While he was at Beaumont's, a man came through Dusty Creek looking for work who gave the town a collective bad feeling from the moment his horse turned onto Main Street. His name was Dale Fitch, and he was loud and restless, and had the particular eyes of a man who had never been obliged to consider anyone else's comfort. He took a room at the Dusty Creek Hotel and spent his evenings at the 3rd Street Saloon picking arguments with people who hadn't invited them, and within a week he had fixed his attention on Mabel Boone in the way that some men fix attention on a woman, not out of genuine interest in who she was, but out of a stubborn conviction that she ought to be interested in him. Mabel was not interested in Dale Fitch. She was polite because she was always polite, and firm because she was always firm, and twice she had redirected his unwelcome approaches with such measured clarity that any reasonable man would have taken the lesson and moved on. Dale Fitch was not a reasonable man. When Clark came back to Dusty Creek at the end of September with his payment from Beaumont in his coat pocket, Hank Prout met him at the edge of town with the look of a man who has been holding onto an uncomfortable piece of information and is relieved to hand it off. "There is a fellow here who has been bothering Miss Boone," Hank said. "She has handled it fine, to her credit. But he is not taking the hint, and I do not have the authority to run him out, and Sheriff Dolly is down in Laredo this week." Clark listened to the rest of what Hank had to say, then rode to the livery, unsaddled his horse, and went to find Mabel at the schoolhouse. She was inside at her desk, writing letters in the last of the afternoon light, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that moved through surprise and into something warmer and relieved before settling into its usual composure. "You are back," she said. "I am," he said. "You all right?" "I am fine," she said, and then, because she was Mabel Boone and not given to understatement when accuracy required otherwise, "There is a man named Dale Fitch who is being a considerable nuisance. I have made my feelings plain, and he does not seem to receive plainness." "I heard," Clark said. He leaned in the doorframe looking at her. "Do you want me to speak to him?" "I do not want you to fight anyone on my account," she said immediately. "That is not the kind of thing I want." "I was not planning on fighting him," Clark said. "I was planning on talking to him. I have found that most men who are very loud can be quieted considerably by a man who is very calm. It disconcerts them." Mabel looked at him with the careful measuring look she sometimes wore when she was deciding how much to trust a thing. "All right," she said at last. "Talk to him." Clark found Dale Fitch at the 3rd Street Saloon that evening. He sat down across from him at his corner table without being invited, folded his hands on the table, and looked at Dale with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has spent half his life working with unpredictable animals and learned that most problems could be solved by remaining absolutely calm and absolutely clear. He spoke quietly. He said what he had to say. He said it only once, and he said it the way men say things when they mean every word of it and don't need volume to prove it. Dale Fitch left Dusty Creek on the morning stage 2 days later and did not return. Mabel found out about it from Hank Prout, who found out from the hotel keeper. She said nothing to Clark about it for nearly a week, and then one evening on the schoolhouse steps she set down her papers and looked at him directly. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did." "It was nothing," Clark said. "It was not nothing," she said firmly. "It was kind, and it was exactly the right way to do it, without making a spectacle and without making me feel as though I needed rescuing, which I find insufferable. You handled it with sense, and I am grateful." Clark looked at her for a moment. "I did not want to step in where you did not want me," he said, "but I also was not going to just let a man make you uncomfortable if I could stop it without anyone getting hurt." "That is a careful balance," she observed. "You are worth the care," he said simply, and then he picked up his whittling because sometimes a thing was better left to settle on its own rather than being pushed at. Mabel looked at the grain of the schoolhouse step for a moment, then picked up her papers, and her cheeks were slightly pink in a way that could not entirely be attributed to the October evening air. October settled over Dusty Creek with the particular golden loveliness of a Texas autumn, the scrub oak turning copper and rust, the light going amber in the mornings, the nights cooling sharp and clear enough to show every star. Mabel had the school running beautifully by now, with a rhythm and a warmth that parents remarked on with gratitude and children demonstrated by showing up willingly, which was perhaps the more meaningful metric. She had also begun to make Dusty Creek her own in small ways. A kitchen garden behind the milliner's shop that Mrs. Caldwell had given over to her with some bewilderment. A weekly reading circle for the women of the town that met on Thursday evenings. A habit of leaving small bundles of dried prairie flowers on the steps of families she knew were struggling that autumn as the drought pinched the ranches hard. She had the deep-rooted quality of a woman who was building a life rather than passing through it, and Dusty Creek was slowly, warmly, entirely realizing it had gotten very lucky. Clark was aware of all of this in the way you are aware of the weather, not always consciously, but always present, informing the way you move through each day. He had now been in Dusty Creek or within a day's ride of it for 2 solid months, which was longer than he had stayed anywhere in 12 years, and when he examined that fact it did not produce the familiar restlessness he might have expected. It produced something quieter, something closer to ease. He had stopped telling himself he was staying for the horses. It was early November when things shifted between them in a way that could not be called friendship anymore without deliberate dishonesty. It happened without drama, the way the most significant things in a life tend to. There had been a community dance at the Grange Hall. Dusty Creek held them every few months, a tradition that most towns in Texas maintained as a rare social occasion that cut across the usual lines of who knew who and who owed who what. The whole town came. The fiddle player was a one-armed man named Silas, who was 3 times better with one arm than most men were with 2. And the dancing floor was packed sawdust, and the lanterns hung from the rafters, and the women wore their best dresses, and the men combed their hair, and by 10 o'clock the hall was warm and bright and loud with music and laughter. Clark did not typically dance. He stood near the back wall with a cup of cider and watched, which had always been sufficient entertainment. But Mabel danced, and watching Mabel dance was something else entirely. She was good at it in the unself-conscious way of someone who simply loved music and let it move her, and she danced with Pete Dorsey's wife first, and then with old Silas himself during a break when he handed his fiddle off and insisted he was owed a turn on the floor. Then the fiddle started up again with a slower reel, and she came toward the back wall where Clark was standing, slightly flushed and bright-eyed and laughing, and she stopped in front of him and put her hand out. "Come on," she said. "You have been standing there all evening like you are guarding the wall, and the wall does not need guarding." "I do not dance," he said. "Everyone can dance," she said. "Some people have simply told themselves they cannot so long that they believe it." She kept her hand out. He looked at her hand and then at her face, which was entirely open and entirely serious and entirely the most compelling thing he had seen in 28 years of looking at the world. He took her hand. He was not a graceful dancer, but he was a man who had spent half his life learning to move in rhythm with another living creature. And dancing was not entirely unlike that. And Mabel was patient and warm, and she laughed when he stepped wrong and corrected him simply by the pressure of her hand and the shift of her body. And by the second turn of the reel, he was doing it reasonably well, and she was looking up at him, with an expression that he felt all the way down to the soles of his boots. They danced 3 dances. Then the fiddle went slow and mournful for a waltz, and she stayed in his arms, and he moved them slowly around the edge of the floor, and nobody said anything to them, because everybody in that hall had been watching the two of them circle each other for 2 months, and the whole town had collectively, silently decided to leave well enough alone and let it happen. Afterward, he walked her home through the cool November night, back to Mrs. Caldwell's place above the milliner's shop. The stars were extraordinary, the way Texas stars are on a cold, clear night, and the town was quiet except for the distant fiddle still carrying from the Grange Hall. They stood on the step of Mrs. Caldwell's for a moment, neither of them quite ready to end the evening. "That was a fine night," Mabel said softly. "It was," Clark agreed. He was looking at her profile against the dark blue of the night sky, the line of her cheek and the loose strand of hair that was always escaping wherever she pinned it. "Mabel." She turned and looked at him. In the starlight her eyes were more gray than blue. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said. "I know that about you," she said, and she said it with such quiet certainty that it struck him how fully she had come to know him in these months, and how entirely, without ceremony or announcement, she had become the person he wanted to be known by. "Then I want to say something to you," he said, "and I want you to know that I mean it." "All right," she said softly. "I do not know entirely what to call what is happening with me," he said. In the careful, honest way he said everything, working through the truth of it rather than decorating it. "But I know that I have been in this town longer than I have been in any place since I was a boy, and I know that when I ride out and come back, the thing I am coming back to is you. And I know that when I think about the road west, the one I always take, I do not want to take it anymore. Not if taking it means leaving you." Mabel was very still. The night breeze moved her hair. "Clark," she said, and her voice was low and soft and just slightly unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. "I came to this town to build something real. I have been moving since I was 19 years old, and I was so tired of moving. I want roots, deep ones." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to know what you would be saying yes to if you were saying yes to anything. I am not a temporary thing." "I know that," he said. "I figured that out the first hour I knew you." She took a breath. "Then I think," she said carefully, "that you ought to call this what it is." "And what is it?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "I think it is love," she said, with the directness that was so wholly her that he loved her for it instantly and completely in a way that was also absolutely no surprise whatsoever, only a kind of clear and settled recognition. He reached out and tucked the escaped strand of hair behind her ear, the way he had wanted to since the very first evening in the schoolhouse, and then he left his hand against her cheek for a moment, and she turned her face just slightly into the warmth of it. "Yes," he said, "that is what it is." The next months in Dusty Creek were the best months either of them had spent anywhere in their lives, and they both knew it. And there was something quietly miraculous about knowing it while it was happening rather than only in the looking back. Clark stopped riding out for more than a few days at a time and started picking up work closer to town. He bought 3 young horses from a rancher named Whitfield outside of Dusty Creek and began breaking and training them in Beaumont's spare corral with the intention of selling them on, which was the beginning of something that could be called a business rather than just a series of jobs. He was good at it and he knew it, and the reputation built quickly, and men started coming to him rather than him going to the work, which changed the mathematics of staying somewhere considerably. He and Mabel saw each other every evening, and those evenings had a warmth and an ease to them that neither of them had ever had with another person. They cooked supper together at Mrs. Caldwell's kitchen table on the evenings when the landlady was with her sister, and they read to each other from Mabel's 32 books. And they argued pleasantly about things they disagreed on. He thought Andrew Jackson had been misrepresented by history, and she thought that was the most objectively wrong opinion she had ever heard from an otherwise intelligent person. And they laughed together often and easily, the kind of laughter that comes from really knowing someone. In December, Clark asked Mabel to walk with him out to the old oak grove east of town on a Sunday afternoon. The groves had mostly shed their leaves by then, but the oaks held theirs longer than the other trees, and the light through the copper-gold canopy was extraordinary. He had something in his coat pocket that he had picked up from the jeweler in Abilene the week before, on the trip he'd told her was for horse business. It was not an extravagant ring. He was not yet an extravagant man, and the business was only just finding its feet. But it was a good ring, solid and real, with a small amber stone that matched the exact shade of the Texas autumn, and when he'd seen it he had thought of her immediately. He did not make a grand speech. That was not who he was. He took her hand in the gold-lit oak grove and looked at her with everything he had, and he said, "I want to build that real thing with you, if you will have me." Mabel looked at the ring in his open palm and then up at him with those eyes that had stopped him cold the first moment he saw her and had never really let him go since. "I thought you were a man who never stayed anywhere," she said softly, not as a challenge, just as a breath. "I never had a reason to," he said. She took the ring from his palm and turned it in the light, and then she held it out to him and said, "Put it on, then." And when he did, she held her hand up and the amber stone caught the oak grove light, and she smiled the private smile she'd worn when she first stepped off that stage and decided that Dusty Creek would do just fine. "Yes," she said, to complete the answer she hadn't given to the first question. "Obviously, yes." He laughed then, a real laugh, unconstrained and bright, and she laughed too, and the oaks rustled overhead in a thin December wind as though in approval, and he pulled her in and held her for a long time in the copper and gold of the afternoon. They were married in February of 1883 in the small Methodist church on the east side of Dusty Creek, which had been freshly whitewashed for the occasion by Pete Dorsey and Louis Ray's and Gerald Garner's two oldest grandsons, who had been Mabel's students since the first day of school and considered themselves personally invested in her happiness. The whole of the town came, which was to say 47 people and 3 dogs who wandered in uninvited and were allowed to stay because nobody had the heart to put them out. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the front row and wept openly, and with no embarrassment whatsoever. Hank Prout performed the ceremony, having obtained a Justice of the Peace certification for the occasion through the county seat, and he did so with considerable dignity despite the fact that he had been rehearsing it in his mirror for 3 weeks. Mabel wore a dress the color of cream with small blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and she had found a way to pin her hair that would presumably hold until the end of the ceremony. It did in fact hold until just after the vows were spoken, at which point a single strand escaped and curled against her cheek exactly as it always did, and Clark, looking at his new wife, found this so entirely perfect that he had to work to keep his expression appropriately solemn while Hank finished the formal pronouncement. They said their vows simply and clearly, looking at each other, and when Clark said, "I do," he said it the way he said everything that he truly meant, without decoration, without performance, just the plain and complete truth of it landing between them like something solid. Mabel said, "I do," with a warmth so complete that half the room had to reach for handkerchiefs. There was a reception at the Grange Hall with more of Silas's fiddling and dancing, and more food than 47 people could reasonably eat, contributed by every household in town in the way that small communities feed their own celebrations. Clark danced much better than he had in November, which Mabel pointed out with some delight, and he told her that he had been practicing in the livery when nobody was watching, and the look on her face at that particular confession was one he planned to remember for the rest of his life. Spring came to Dusty Creek with the particular extravagance that the Texas plains sometimes produce, After a dry autumn, wildflowers spreading out across the grasslands in sheets of color. The creek running again with snowmelt from the far north. The air sweet and full of promise. Clark had by now established his horse training operation properly on a small parcel of land southeast of town that he had purchased from Lloyd Beaumont's neighbor, a widower named Cross who was moving to San Antonio to live near his daughter. The land was 14 acres with a solid creekstone house in need of some work, and a good barn and a corral, and a stretch of pasture that would do well once it had been properly managed. He and Mabel spent the spring fixing the house. This was not a metaphor. It was a literal and physical undertaking involving 2 months of their evenings and weekends and every willing hand they could call on. And the result was a home that was exactly what it was supposed to be, not grand, not showy, simply real and well-made and full of care. Mabel's 32 books went on the shelf Clark built along the entire south wall of the front room, which had been designed to accommodate them with the precise dimensions she had provided, and she pressed her hand flat against the finished wood with the same gesture she had used in the empty schoolhouse on the evening they first met. And Clark, watching her from across the room, felt something in his chest that was so full and quiet and complete that it was almost indistinguishable from peace. She planted her garden that first spring with the same systematic attention her mother had brought to the cataloging of Gulf Coast plants, tomatoes and beans and squash, and a border of lavender along the south fence that would bloom purple and sweet every summer for the next 40 years, though neither of them knew that yet. She kept teaching, because she was Mabel Boone and the school was her work and her calling, and she had never had any intention of stopping, and Clark supported this with the uncomplicated wholeness of a man who had fallen in love with who a person was rather than who he might prefer them to be. The school grew that year. 2 families came to Dusty Creek from the east, the Harmon family with 4 children and the Lattimore family with 3, and a Tejano family named Flores settled on land south of the creek and sent their 2 children to Mabel's school, and she welcomed them all with the same patient warmth and made sure the Flores children, whose English was still growing, found their footing in the classroom with the gentle ingenuity of a teacher who understood that learning came in different shapes and that all of them were valid. It was in the summer of that year, 1883, a Tuesday evening in July when the light stayed long and golden over the plains, that Mabel came home from the schoolhouse to find Clark at the corral fence watching a young buckskin colt he'd just acquired from a rancher near Lubbock. She leaned on the fence beside him, and they watched the colt move together in the easy silence that had become one of their great shared pleasures. Then she said, without preface, "I think we are going to have a baby." Clark turned and looked at her. She was watching the colt with a small, careful smile, as though she was still adjusting to the fact of it herself. "I am not entirely certain yet," she said. "But I think so." He set his hands over hers on the fence rail. She turned and looked at him. "Are you all right?" she asked, because she was always more concerned with how he was than whether he would be pleased. "I am more than all right," he said. "I am—" He stopped, working for the word, and then he shook his head slightly because there was no word adequate for what he was, so he turned her hand over in his and pressed his mouth to her palm, and she understood that entirely. The certainty of the baby settled in over the next few weeks, confirmed by the town doctor, a gray-haired man named Ellis who had been practicing in Dusty Creek for 20 years and regarded the Wilcox marriage with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had watched both of them arrive at each other from a good vantage point. "Everything looks fine," Ellis told them, with the measured reassurance of an experienced man. "Strong and healthy. You have done nothing wrong, Mrs. Wilcox." Mabel still sometimes caught on the new name, not with regret, but with the mild surprise of someone whose identity had recently and willingly expanded. She kept teaching until November, when the pregnancy had become both obvious and physically demanding enough that she arranged for Hank Pruitt's niece, a sensible young woman named Clara who had trained in schooling in Fort Worth, to take the class for the final months of the school year. This arrangement was temporary and everyone knew it, including Clara, who understood she was holding the school in trust and would hand it back when Mabel was ready. Clark took on no travel work at all that autumn. He stayed. He had horses on his own land to work and orders in from 3 ranches to fill through the spring, and the business was doing well enough that he could be selective about what he took and from whom, which was a freedom he had not had in his working years on the road. He made sure there was always wood cut and water carried, and supper something Mabel could stomach, which in the first months was a list that changed daily and without notice. He learned to make a plain rice broth that she found tolerable on the worst evenings, and he learned which things not to cook anywhere near her, and he learned to ask what she needed rather than assume, and when she was tired, he read to her from the 32 books because she had read to him from them often enough and it was his turn. She liked most for him to read from the naturalist's guide her mother had written, the one about the Gulf Coast plants. He read it in his quiet, unhurried voice, and she lay with her head on his shoulder in the lamplight, and sometimes she was asleep before he'd finished a page, and sometimes she was wide awake, and telling him about a memory of her mother in the field. And he held her and listened and thought that this particular life, was the most complete thing he had ever been a part of. Thomas Clark Wilcox was born on the 8th of February, 1884, in the stone house southeast of Dusty Creek, during a cold, clear night with a full moon over the plains. Dr. Ellis attended, along with Mrs. Caldwell and Gerald Garner's wife Martha, who had delivered enough babies to constitute a secondary medical authority. The labor was long, and Mabel was strong throughout it with the particular determined grace she brought to everything hard, and Clark sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours in a condition of sustained terror that he would later describe only as the worst night of my life and also the best, which was both perfectly accurate and perfectly inadequate. When Martha Garner opened the door and told him to come in, he crossed the threshold into the lamplight and found Mabel sitting up against the pillows with her hair loose, and her face exhausted and radiant, and looking down at the small, wrapped person in her arms with an expression so full of love and wonder that Clark had to stop walking for a moment because his eyes had unexpectedly done something they had not done in 12 years of hard and solitary living. "Come here," Mabel said, and her voice was low and warm as a hearthstone. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she tilted the baby so he could see the face, red and new and scrunched with the effort of being recently born, and the baby opened his eyes and they were dark blue in the lamplight, the way all new babies' eyes were, and Clark looked at his son for the first time and felt something close in his chest that had been standing open since he was 16 years old on the road out of Waco. "Thomas," Mabel said softly, "after your father's father." Clark had mentioned his grandfather Thomas once, months ago, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. That she had remembered and kept it and chosen to honor it this way, this was so completely Mabel that he could not speak for a moment. "Thomas Clark Wilcox," he said finally. "That is right," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her very gently, and they looked at their son together in the lamplight. And outside the stone house, the Texas winter stars were brilliant and cold and endless overhead, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the creek to the south ran silver in the moonlight, and everything in the world was precisely as it should be. Dusty Creek, being Dusty Creek, received the news of the baby's arrival with the collective enthusiasm of a community that had been emotionally invested in these two people since roughly September of 1882. Hank Prout sent a formal announcement to the Harlan County Gazette. Pete Dorsey and Louis Rays showed up the following week with a carved oak cradle that had taken them 2 months to build. Martha Garner brought 3 pots of preserved peaches and a quilt. The Flores family sent tamales. Mrs. Caldwell came every other day for the first month on the stated purpose of helping, and the real purpose of holding the baby, which Mabel permitted with generous grace. Mabel went back to the schoolhouse in April, when Thomas was 6 weeks old, with Clara still helping 2 days a week for the transition. She brought Thomas with her the first few times, with a basket set behind the desk, and the children were so enchanted and so careful around the baby that it became a secondary lesson in the curriculum, a lesson in tenderness, which Mabel considered just as important as arithmetic. The spring of 1884 passed into a full and contented summer. Clark's horse business had grown to the point where he employed Louis Ray's part-time for the training and a young man named Samuel Beck, just turned 19, as a full hand, and the Wilcox stock was beginning to have a reputation in the county that reached further than the county. Men came from Amarillo, from Lubbock, from as far as the New Mexico territory to look at Clark Wilcox's horses, and they usually bought what they came to see. He was home every evening. He had been home every evening for almost 2 years, which was 24 times longer than he had stayed anywhere in his adult life. And when he thought about that, which he didn't very often because it simply was what it was, it struck him not as a sacrifice or a surrender, but as the most sensible thing he had ever done. He had ridden a great deal of this country, and he had seen a great deal of it, and it was beautiful and vast, and there was a particular freedom in it that he had needed for a long time, a freedom that had served its purpose. What he had now was something different. What he had now was better. It was in September of 1884, on a warm golden evening when Thomas was 7 months old, and pulling himself to standing against the corral fence, with the kind of focused physical determination that was immediately recognizable as a family trait, that Mabel came and stood beside Clark at the fence where he was watching with the particular parental vigilance that masquerades as casual observation. She watched Thomas wobble upright and grab the fence rail with both fists and look enormously pleased with himself, and then she looked at Clark. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always," he said. She looked at him sideways with the combination of directness and warmth that was so entirely her own. "Do you think you will ever want to settle down properly? I mean completely. No more thinking about the road. No more roads west." He looked at her. He looked at Thomas, who had now sat down hard on the ground with a thump and was examining a pebble with intense scholarly concentration. He looked at the creek stone house behind them with the lavender along the south fence and the 32 books on the shelf inside, and the 2 horses in the near pasture that were his and nobody else's. He looked at the Texas sky, wide and blue and full of afternoon light. He looked back at Mabel, who was watching him with those storm sky eyes that had stopped him cold in the middle of Main Street 2 years ago and never entirely given him back to himself, which he found, to his lasting and complete satisfaction, to be entirely all right with him. "Mabel," he said. "Clark," she said. He smiled, the kind of smile that starts slow and goes all the way to his eyes, the smile she had worked a full month to see the first time and now could produce in him with a glance, a word, the simple fact of her presence. He picked up her hand from the fence rail and turned to face her. "I already did," he said, "the day you came to town." She looked at him for a long moment, and something moved in her face, not surprise because she had known it, but the particular depth of feeling that comes when a thing you have known in your heart is spoken aloud and made real in the air between 2 people. She pressed his hand between both of hers. "Good," she said softly, "because I intend to keep you." He laughed. "You already have me," he said. "You had me when you walked off that stage with 32 books under your arm and looked at this dusty little town like it was worth looking at." "It was worth looking at," she said. "It had you in it." Thomas, on the ground below them, had lost interest in the pebble and was now attempting to eat a small amount of dirt with the resigned scientific curiosity of a 7-month-old. And Clark leaned down and redirected this interest with the ease of a man who had spent his career anticipating what creatures of strong will and limited experience were likely to do next. The years in Dusty Creek moved with the full and steady rhythm of a life properly inhabited. Clark's horse operation grew into one of the most respected in West Texas, and the name Wilcox became known among ranchers and cavalry officers and cattlemen alike as a guarantee of quality horses that were well broken, sound in their minds, trained with patience rather than force, and consequently more reliable and more willing than anything else on the market. He hired 2 more hands by 1886, and by 1887 he had added a second corral and a breaking pen and a proper tack room to the original barn, and the 14 acres had expanded by another 30 when he bought the parcel to the east from the Harmon family when they moved north to Kansas. Mabel's school was the finest within 100 miles, and she intended to keep it that way, and the intention was backed by the kind of disciplined, creative effort that produced actual results. By 1886, the school had 29 students, and she had submitted a proposal to the Harlan County Education Board for a second teacher, a proposal that was approved in the spring of 1887, with the hire of a young man named Robert Foss, fresh from a teacher's college in Houston, who was earnest and capable and slightly terrified of Mabel for the first month, until he understood that her standards were high because she believed in him, not because she doubted him. After which they worked together with great mutual respect and considerable productivity. Thomas was walking by the time he was 11 months old and running by 13 months, and climbing the corral fence by 18 months, and sitting on the back of a mild and carefully chosen mare by the time he was 2 years old, with his father's hand steady at his back, and the look on his face of a person who has been born to exactly this. He had Mabel's eyes and Clark's jaw and an entirely individual personality that contained the best of both his parents' qualities: the directness, the warmth, the quiet determination, the capacity for deep and uncomplicated joy. He also had a little sister by the time he was 2.5, because the house was happy and the years were full, and a baby girl arrived in November of 1886 with a quantity of dark hair and Clark's brown eyes, and Mabel's particular air of having strong opinions about everything and intending to make them known, which she immediately demonstrated by crying loudly and specifically at every stimulus except her father's voice, which quieted her with a speed that Clark found both flattering and vaguely alarming in its implications for his future authority. They named her Clara June Wilcox, the Clara for the young teacher who had helped hold the school during both pregnancies, the June for the month Mabel had arrived in Dusty Creek and first seen the possibility of home in it. Mrs. Caldwell, who had wept through the wedding and wept when Thomas was born, wept so thoroughly at Clara's arrival that Dr. Ellis suggested with some concern that she stay hydrated. The family was, in the simplest and truest sense, well. Not without difficulty, because no life is without difficulty, and the drought of 1886 hit the county hard and cut into the ranching operations that were Clark's primary customers, and there was a lean winter that year that required real care and some sacrifice. Clark sold 2 horses he had planned to keep to cover the gap, and Mabel organized a community aid effort through the school families that distributed resources more evenly through the hardest weeks, and they came through it without serious damage, but with a renewed and sharp appreciation for what they had. There were hard things of another kind, too. In the spring of 1887, they received news that Clark's oldest brother Will had died in Waco of a fever, and Clark rode down there alone for the burial, and came back quieter than usual and sat for a long time on the porch in the evenings looking at the plains with a look that Mabel recognized as the particular grief of a family relationship that had never been properly repaired and now never could be. She sat with him in those evenings without requiring him to speak about it, which was exactly what he needed, and eventually the grief settled into its place in him, and he came back to himself and held his children more often that summer, which was, perhaps, its own kind of answer to mortality. Thomas started school in the fall of 1887, which was an occasion of considerable emotional complexity for his mother, who managed to be simultaneously extremely proud of herself for maintaining professional composure on the first day, and completely undone the moment the school door closed and she was alone in the classroom with 28 children. one of whom was her son looking up at her from the third row with Clark's expression of calm attention and the slightly mischievous edge that was all his own. She loved him so much it was like a physical thing, a permanent pressure against her ribs, and she taught him as she taught all her students with rigor and tenderness, and the absolute conviction that every child in that room was capable of more than they had yet been asked to give. He was, objectively, an excellent student. She told Clark this with the careful neutrality of a professional educator and the transparent delight of a mother, and he listened with his arms folded and his expression composed, and the smile working at the corner of his mouth that she had learned to read 2 years before she ever kissed him. 1988 brought good years back. The rains came in March, early and generous, and the creek ran strong all spring, and the pastures greened up, and the ranches recovered, and Clark's order book filled fast. He and Louis Reyes had developed what amounted to a training method patient, systematic, rooted in the idea that a horse that understands what is being asked of it will do more and last longer than one that has been simply overpowered. And the method was producing horses of such consistent quality that a buyer came out from the Army Remount Service in August and put in an order for 20 horses to be delivered the following spring, which was the largest single contract Clark had ever received, and which he celebrated by telling Mabel about it over supper with the understatement of a man for whom good news is a thing to be handled carefully, and Mabel celebrated it by standing up from the supper table, sitting down in his lap, and kissing him in a way that caused Thomas, 5 years old and eating his beans with focused attention, to look up and say with weary tolerance, "Again," which caused his parents to dissolve entirely. The Army contract was the making of the Wilcox operation as a serious enterprise. Clark fulfilled it on time and to a standard that earned a letter of commendation from the purchasing officer, and the follow-on orders came in quickly, and by 1889 the business had expanded to the point where he needed an additional 40 acres of pasture and a larger breaking pen, and a dedicated barn for the contract horses separate from his breeding stock. He hired 3 more men. Samuel Beck, now 24, had been with him 5 years and was Clark's most trusted hand, and had his own quarter share of the business by now. A broad-shouldered Comanche man named James Crow, whose family had been displaced from their traditional lands by the reservation system in the 1870s, and who had spent 15 years as a working cowhand on various Texas ranches, developing horsemanship skills that Clark recognized immediately as exceptional and hired him without hesitation. And a young man of 17 named Ford, who had shown up at the gate one morning looking for work, and had the kind of steady eyes and willing hands that Clark had learned to trust more than recommendations. James Crow was a quiet and dignified man who had seen a great deal of injustice in his life, without letting it extinguish either his skill or his sense of himself, and Clark treated him with the same straightforward respect he gave anyone who worked well and honestly. Mabel, who understood something about what it meant to build a life in the face of systems that would prefer you elsewhere, talked with James when he was comfortable talking, and eventually they had long conversations about education, about his children, 2 daughters and a son who had not had access to proper schooling, and about whether they might be allowed to attend Mabel's school. They were. Mabel said so without hesitation and meant it without qualification, and the first morning James Crow's daughter Margaret walked into the Dusty Creek schoolhouse, Mabel welcomed her exactly as she had welcomed every child who had ever come through that door, by learning her name and asking what she liked to read. This was not without friction in the town. There were men in Dusty Creek who had opinions about it, loud opinions, and 2 fathers of other students who came to Mabel and made those opinions clear. Mabel heard them out completely, as she always did when someone came to her with a complaint, and then she told them, with perfect composure and absolute firmness, that her school was for the children of this county, and she had no intention of turning a child away based on their family's background, and that if they felt otherwise, they were welcome to write to the Harlan County Education Board, who had hired her with full authority over the administration of this school, and that she hoped very much that they would think carefully about what they were teaching their own children by where they chose to draw their lines. The two fathers went away grumbling, but they did not remove their children from school, and within 2 months Margaret Crowe was sitting in the second row next to Pete Dorsey's daughter Anne, and the two of them were inseparable, and nobody said anything about it anymore. Clark heard about this from Samuel Beck and said nothing except to tell Mabel at supper that evening that she was the finest person he had ever known, and she told him that was a very high opinion to maintain and she intended to deserve it, and he said she already did and always had, and Thomas, 7 years old by now, looked between his parents and said, "Are you going to do the kissing thing again?" And Clara, 3 and imperious, said, "I like the kissing thing," and the whole table laughed. The evening on the porch was their ritual, Clark and Mabel's, after the children were in bed. They sat in the 2 wooden chairs he had built himself the first summer in the stone house, which had been repaired and re-sanded and re-oiled many times since and were still the most comfortable chairs either of them owned. The Texas sky in the evenings was one of the permanent extravagances of their life on the plains, vast and changing, and never the same 2 nights running, going through amber and rose and deep violet, and finally the full black spread of stars that on clear nights seemed close enough to reach. They talked and they were sometimes silent, and they held hands across the space between the chairs, and they were profoundly, quietly, comprehensively happy in a way that neither of them had expected when they were younger and moving through the world alone, the way that the best things in a life are never quite what you imagined but are somehow, inexplicably, more. Do you ever miss it? Mabel asked him one such evening in the autumn of 1889, when Thomas was 6 and Clara was 3 and the air smelled of harvest and wood smoke, and the creek ran low and silver in the distance. "Miss what?" Clark said. "The road," she said. "The freedom of it." He thought about it honestly, the way she always asked and expected. He thought about the particular sensation of open country stretching ahead of you, nothing decided, nothing fixed, the pure and careless possibility of it. He had loved that genuinely when he was younger. It had been exactly what he needed then. "No," he said at last, and it was true without qualification. "I have everything I need right here. What I miss about the road is what I was looking for on it. I found it. It turned out to be you." Mabel was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said, and I want you to know that I am saving it." "It is true," he said simply. "I know it is," she said. "That is what makes it romantic." He looked at her in the last of the evening light, at the face he had come to know so well that he could read it in the dark. The way she tilted her head when she was amused, the small crease between her brows when she was thinking hard, the way her whole expression changed when she looked at their children, the way it changed again when she looked at him, specific and full, and meant only for him. He thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that of all the things he had done in his life, every horse he had broken, every mile he had ridden, every job he had worked in every corner of West Texas, the single most important thing he had ever done was stand still on a dusty street in June of 1882 and notice a woman stepping off a stage with 32 books under her arm. The winter of 1889 settled in deep and cold, deeper than most years, and the plains west of Dusty Creek went white and still under a series of storms that came down from the north in December and January and kept the town hunkered close around its fires. The school closed for 2 weeks in January when the cold was at its worst, and Mabel brought home armloads of books and taught Thomas and Clara at the kitchen table with the focused inventiveness of a woman who had never once been willing to accept that circumstances meant education had to stop. Clark and Samuel and James worked through the cold, keeping the horses fed and sheltered with the quiet and total dedication of men for whom the animals in their care were a serious responsibility rather than just a livelihood. Clark came in from the barn every evening with frozen hands and the look of a man who has been outside in real weather and is glad to be in. And Mabel had something hot on the wood stove, and the lamp lit, and the children waiting. And the stone house was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Thomas, growing fast and serious and fascinated by everything, had developed a deep absorption in astronomy, which had started with Mabel reading him a children's primer on the night sky, and had expanded rapidly into a genuine scholarly interest, expressed by lying on his back on the porch on clear nights and mapping star positions with a small notebook and a charcoal pencil with an intensity that was both completely his mother's mind and completely his father's application of it. Clark bought him a proper star atlas from the bookshop in Abilene for his 7th birthday, and the look on Thomas's face when he unwrapped it was the look of someone being handed exactly the right thing, and Clark felt the kind of parental satisfaction that is so complete it almost hurts. Clara at 4 was already deeply clear about who she was and what she wanted was primarily horses, a preference she expressed by spending as much time at the corral fence as could be managed without alarming her parents, and by announcing firmly that she wanted to learn to ride properly and not just sit on the old mare with someone holding the reins. Clark began teaching her in the spring of 1890, in the smallest corral with a gentle gray pony he had specifically selected and trained for the purpose, and she took to it with a natural ease that was not surprising from a child who had been watching her father work horses her entire life. And Clark taught her with the same patience and clarity he brought to the horses themselves, which produced, by the end of that first spring, a 4-year-old who could walk and trot the pony in a balanced and confident circle, and who looked, on horseback, so entirely like she belonged there that it made Clark unexpectedly proud in a way he could not entirely account for. Mabel watched this from the fence and felt something so warm and full that it was almost like laughter, the kind that comes from the chest rather than the throat. This was her family. This was the real thing she had set out to build when she was 19 years old and her father had died, and she had looked at the shape of her life and decided it needed to be made deliberately, chosen carefully, built with both hands. She had done that. She was still doing that every day in the school and in the stone house, and in the marriage that was the best choice she had ever made and grew stronger and richer every year they lived in it. In the summer of 1890, 8 years after Mabel had stepped off that stage and Clark had stood against the post of the general store and felt something shift in his chest, Dusty Creek held a celebration for the school's anniversary. Mabel had been teaching there for 8 years, and the community wanted to mark it, not in the grand style of a city event, but in the direct and personal way of a town that knew its own and intended to honor what it valued. They held it in the schoolhouse itself, which had been decorated by the current students with bunting and hand-lettered banners and a great deal of wildflowers from the summer plains. Almost all of Mabel's former students came, grown now, the oldest of them 16 and 17, and in some cases already working full-time on ranches or helping their families. And they sat in the desks they had outgrown with the self-conscious dignity of young people who do not quite know where to put themselves in a formal situation, but know enough to sit still and be grateful. Hank Prout gave a speech of the kind he had been giving for years, longer than necessary and genuinely felt, and then he handed the floor to Clark, because the town had decided that Clark should say something, and he had agreed to this with the reluctance of a man who does not enjoy speaking publicly, and the willingness of a man who would do anything for his wife. He stood up in front of that room full of people, the students and their parents, the neighbors and friends, James Crow and Samuel Beck in the back row, Louis Ray's and Pete Dorsey and Gerald Garner's family and Mrs. Caldwell in the front with her handkerchief already out, and he looked at Mabel, who was sitting in the teacher's chair beside the desk with Thomas on one side of her and Clara on the other, both children watching their father with the patient attention of people who know this person and trust what he is about to say. "I am not a man who makes long speeches," Clark said, and a wave of affectionate laughter moved through the room because they all knew this about him, and it was true. So I will say one thing. 8 years ago, this town needed a school teacher, and a woman named Mabel Boone came off the stage with a crate of books and a look on her face that said she had already decided Dusty Creek was worth something, before she had seen more than the street it sits on. He looked at her. She has been deciding that every day since, and she has been making it true. Every child in this town who can read and figure and think for themselves, that is because of her. Every one of them. He stopped for a moment, and then he said, more quietly, "And the rest of us who have had the great good fortune of knowing her, I think we can say the same thing." There was a silence, and then the whole room applauded, and Mrs. Caldwell wept, and Mabel sat in the teacher's chair with her composure intact, and her eyes brilliant with something that was not quite tears and was more than happiness, something for which there is no single word in English, the feeling of a life that has been built exactly as you hoped it would be built, standing solid around you and the people who love you, and the work you have done, and the place you have chosen to call home. She stood and came to where Clark was standing at the front of the room, and she took his hand and turned to face the assembled room, and thanked them all, every student and every family, the town that had welcomed her and grown with her and trusted her with their children, the man beside her who had made a home with her and meant it fully and never once given her cause to doubt it. That evening, after the celebration and after the children were in bed, they sat on the porch in the wooden chairs, and the stars were extraordinary overhead, and the night was warm, and the plains were wide and silver in the moonlight. 8 years, Mabel said. 8 years, Clark agreed. She leaned her head back against the chair and looked up at the stars. "When I came here, I thought I was coming for the school," she said. "I did not know I was coming home." "Neither did I," Clark said. "I did not know I was looking for one. I thought I was just looking." He turned his head to look at her in the starlight. "Turns out I found it." She reached across and took his hand the way she had taken it 1,000 times, easily and completely, and held it the way you hold something you have no intention of ever letting go of. They sat together in the warm Texas night, in the life they had built and intended to keep building, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the creek ran silver in the moonlight, and the two children slept soundly in their rooms inside the stone house, and somewhere in the vast dark west of them, an owl called once, twice, and was answered by a long and peaceful silence. Clark Wilcox, who had once ridden every road in West Texas and called none of them home, was precisely where he needed to be. He had known it since a June morning in 1882. He had never once wanted anything different, and he never would. The years continued to fill and deepen as years do when they are lived with care. The Army contracts continued and expanded, and by 1892, the Wilcox horse operation was supplying stock to the Army remount program in 3 states and had a waiting list that stretched 6 months out. Clark managed it with the same direct, honest practicality he'd brought to every job in his life, and what had started as a man with a skill and a desire to stay in one place had become a genuine enterprise that employed 7 men permanently and provided well for all of them and their families. Samuel Beck married in 1891, a quiet, good-natured woman from the neighboring town of Beckett, a schoolmate of Clara Harmon's, and Clark and Mabel attended the wedding with Thomas and Clara and sat in the front pew because Samuel had asked them to be there as family rather than employers, which was exactly how they thought of him. James Crow's son William started school with Mabel in 1891 and proved to be one of the most quietly remarkable students she had taught, a reader of extraordinary depth and appetite, solemn and thorough, with a particular gift for mathematics that Mabel nurtured with every resource she had, including ordering advanced texts from Austin and eventually writing to the Harlan County Education Board to ask, somewhat forcefully, what provisions existed for students who had surpassed the ordinary curriculum. The board's response was inadequate, and Mabel wrote again, and then again, and eventually an arrangement was made through a college preparatory program in Fort Worth that would allow William to continue his education at a level equal to his ability, which was the outcome Mabel had been working toward and fully expected to achieve, because she did not give up on her students, not ever, and she did not accept that the circumstances of their birth determined the ceiling of their possibilities. When she told Clark about the Fort Worth arrangement at supper one evening, his face went through a series of expressions that she had learned to read fluently over the course of a decade: the careful listening, the slight narrowing of consideration, and then the fully settled warmth of a man who had married a woman who did exactly what she set out to do and was never surprised by it but was always moved by it. "His father is going to weep," Clark said. "James does not weep," Mabel said. "He will for this," Clark said, and he was right. Thomas Wilcox, approaching his 10th birthday in 1894, had grown into a quiet, observant, deeply intelligent boy who was everything his parents had hoped a child might be and several things they hadn't expected. He had his father's capacity for physical work and his mother's hunger for learning, and he had a particular clarity about what he thought was right and wrong that expressed itself not in self-righteousness, but in a simple, undramatic willingness to stand by what he believed when it was tested, which it occasionally was in the ordinary way of schoolboys. He was also, despite all of Clark's determined teaching otherwise, not particularly interested in horses as a primary vocation, which Clark had made his peace with by the time Thomas was 8, having understood that what he wanted to give his son was not a specific life, but the capacity to build whatever life suited him. What Thomas wanted, with increasing clarity, was to study the natural sciences, astronomy first, then geology, then the full breadth of the natural world, and Mabel fed this with her usual thoroughness, adding titles to the original 32 books with a regularity that had expanded the south wall shelf to 2 full walls and was beginning to overflow into the hallway. Clara at 8 was everything on horseback that her early promise had suggested, and a good deal more. She rode with Clark on the ranch work now when it was safe and practical, learning the operation with the same systematic attention her mother brought to the school, and she had a temperament with horses that was intuitive and rare, not just technique, but something deeper, the ability to read what an animal needed before it showed distress, which Clark recognized because he had spent 30 years developing it himself and had never seen it so naturally present in someone so young. "She is going to take this over one day," Samuel Beck said to Clark one afternoon, watching Clara bring a young mare around the far end of the breaking pen with the composure of someone twice her age. "I know," Clark said, with a mixture of pride and something tender that was not quite sadness but was adjacent to it. "Is that all right with you?" Clark watched his daughter on the mare. "It is the best possible thing," he said. "It means it continues." By the middle of 1894, the Wilcox family had lived on the southeast 44 acres for over 10 years, and the property had the settled, lived-in look of a place that has been properly cared for through many seasons. The lavender border thick and fragrant along the south fence, the oak tree by the barn grown tall enough to shade the east side of the house in the afternoon, the kitchen garden expanded and producing. The house itself whitewashed clean and tight, and full to the edges with books and lamplight, and the ongoing rich texture of a family's daily life. It was in the fall of 1894, on the anniversary of their first October together, the one when they had worked in the schoolhouse and walked back through Dusty Creek in the sharp new autumn air, that Mabel and Clark sat on the porch together in the evening as they had done 10,000 times, and Mabel looked at the painted Texas sky, and then at her husband with the frank and direct gaze that had stopped him in the middle of Main Street and never quite let him go, and she said, "We are going to need a bigger bookshelf." He looked at her. She was smiling, and there was a specific quality to the smile, a kind of private brightness that he had seen before in their life together exactly twice, and both times had turned out to be the best news he had ever received in any form. "Mabel," he said. "Next spring," she said. "April or May, Ellis thinks." He sat very still for a moment in the way he sat still when something was very large, and then he reached across and took her hand and looked at her with eyes that were entirely full. "A bigger bookshelf," he said. "And a bigger table," she said. "Thomas and Clara are going to need more room." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to it, just as he had in the oak grove when she had held out the ring. And she leaned across from her chair, and he met her halfway and kissed her in the warm autumn evening with the stars beginning to come up over the plains, and the horses quiet in the barn, and the lights burning inside the stone house, where their children were doing their lessons. The baby arrived in April of 1895, a boy, strong and bright-eyed, who came into the world with a decisive and vocal announcement of his own presence that made Dr. Ellis laugh out loud. They named him James Robert Wilcox James for James Crow, who had been part of the Wilcox operation for 7 years, and whose friendship and loyalty Clark valued as deeply as almost anything in his working life, and Robert for Robert Foss, Mabel's partner at the school, who had been in Dusty Creek for 8 years, and had become as much a part of the town's fabric as anyone born there. James Crow, upon being told the baby's name, stood very still for a long moment and then nodded once, which in his particular economy of expression represented something considerable, and Clark understood it perfectly. Thomas, at 11, regarded his new brother with the scientific detachment of a future naturalist, and then held him with a gravity and gentleness that made Mabel's heart press against her ribs. Clara, at 8, held the baby with the practiced competence of a girl who had been watching how to handle young creatures carefully for most of her life, and the baby looked up at her with the unfocused dark eyes of the newborn, and she looked down at him and said firmly, "I will teach you to ride when you are big enough," which Clark, leaning in the doorway, received as one of the finest statements he had ever heard. The spring of 1895 settled over the Wilcox land and over Dusty Creek like everything good settles when it is allowed to stay, gradually, thoroughly, without ceremony, simply becoming part of the landscape. The lavender bloomed purple and deep along the south fence. The creek ran strong. The horses moved in the pasture in the long evenings, their coats catching the low gold light, and the stone house with its 2 walls of books and its 3 children and its well-worn porch chairs was full to overflowing with the specific and irreplaceable substance of a life deliberately and lovingly made. And on those evenings, when the work was done and the children were accounted for, and the Texas stars were coming up enormous and clear over the open plains, Clark Wilcox sat on his porch in his own chair with his wife beside him and her hand in his, and thought, not often, not sentimentally, but with the simple and complete acknowledgement of a man who knows himself and his own history, of the road he had ridden for 12 years, and all the towns he had passed through. And the single morning in June of 1882, when a stagecoach had stopped on Main Street, and everything had changed. He had not known, standing at that post with his hat tipped low and his toothpick between his teeth, what he was about to find. He had not known that the rest of his life was stepping off that coach with a crate of books and a calm, considering gaze and a private smile that he would spend the next decade and beyond working to deserve. But he knew it now. He had known it for 12 years. Every morning when he woke up in the stone house with the plains outside the window and the sound of his children and his wife inside the walls, every evening on the porch in the wooden chairs, every day of work on land that was his and horses that were his and a life that was entirely, permanently, completely his own. He had settled down. He had settled completely, fully in the most real sense of the word, not trapped, not resigned, not diminished, but rooted. Roots like the old oak by the barn, the kind that split the ground and hold against anything. And the day it happened, the precise moment it had happened, was the summer morning in 1882 when Mabel Boone had stepped into Dusty Creek and looked at the street and smiled, and Clark Wilcox had straightened off the post and felt something shift in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of clear, deep water, and known, without being able to say it yet, that the road was finished. Mabel reached across in the evening dark and laced her fingers through his, the way she had for 12 years, and he held on, the way he intended to for whatever years came next. And the stars came up over Texas in their thousands, and the plains were still and wide, and the world was exactly as it should be. And everything, all of it was closed and settled and home.